Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Well, hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm joined by the 29th Prime Minister of Australia and 12th Leader of the Liberal Party, Malcolm Turnbull, for a lovely discussion, I can only imagine, on what it means to be a Liberal and your thoughts on Robert Menzies. So welcome to Afternoon Light, Malcolm.
Yeah, thank you, Georgina. It's lovely to see you again.
It's lovely to see you too, and lovely to be here in Sydney, where I am roasting in comparison to the Melbourne I left this morning.
And I should just note, for the benefit of Melbourne listeners, that I am wearing a pullover, because for me this is cold in Sydney.
Yes, yeah, this is definitely where our cities have a major divergence on climate. But Malcolm, at the Robert Menzies Institute, we have been speaking to all the former leaders who are living, of course, of the Liberal Party. And it's been wonderful to speak to them about Robert Menzies and the Liberal Party and what it really means to them and what the Menzies legacy means to them. So I'd love to start our discussion by asking you how you came to join the Liberal Party. What was your journey? What attracted you?
Well, it wasn't a pretty short journey. I joined the Liberal Party in 1973. So it was a very long time ago, which is actually, now I think about it, that's 50 years ago. And basically, I just started at university. I was very keenly interested in politics. I'd certainly had a look at the left. My mother was really always a Labor person. I don't think she was ever very active in the Labor Party, but she was a Labor historian. She wrote quite a lot about the history of the Australian Workers' Union, and that was her as a historian. She moved into Victorian novel and Victorian literature later, but she's, as an academic, her initial work was with Labor history. But I am very much a Liberal. For me, I like freedom, I like all the flexibility, opportunity that comes from a free society. And so I'm very much a small L Liberal. And so the Liberal Party seemed more suitable to me. So I did join the Liberal Party in 73. To be honest, I got involved with a bit of young Liberal stuff, but nothing terribly notable. And then once I started working as a political journalist, which was within a few years of that, by 75, 76, 75 certainly, latter part of 75, I was writing about politics, and I let my membership lapse. I just didn't think it was appropriate to be a member of any political party, and I wasn't. Then I rejoined the party,
of course,
after I got back from, I rejoined it after I got back from Oxford, actually, in 1980.
Yes.
And then I was quite active in the party branch level and stuff for a few years. And then when we got the Republican movement going, again, it was part of the proposition of the ARM was that it was non-political. Although obviously I had a Liberal background, I'd run for pre-selection in Wentworth in 81. And then I rejoined the party after the Republic referendum when I was stepped down as chair of the ARM. So the only political party I've been a member of which, fields candidates, as opposed to something like the ARM, is the Liberal Party.
So in 1973, when you first joined, I'm thinking about the time, the Liberal Party had just lost. Billy McMahon had just lost in 72. Gough Whitlam had been elected. So if you were thinking of a time to join a party, you were pretty much joining it at its
it was
at its low point.
Well, I suppose I've always been slightly contrasuggestible, I guess. But yeah, and look, it was interesting. I'd make a couple of points about the Liberal Party. In 1973, my recollection of the Liberal Party in Wentworth, which is where I grew up and where I've always lived, was that it was composed of a pretty representative cross-section of the middle class.
Yeah.
There were local solicitors and there were QCs, Phillip Street. There were local GPs and there were specialists from Macquarie Street. They were more men than women. They were older than average, but it was very much a cross-section of that sort of professional middle-class group that Menzies had galvanised into supporting him and the Liberal Party when he founded it in 1944.
Was there something that you'd been studying at university, things you'd read that had attracted you to liberal ideas?
Yes, I'd
Studied
read
political science.
read John Stuart Mill, but I was, to be honest, I was very interestingly, I mean, for someone who is naturally a liberal, I was also very interested in conservatism. And so I was very influenced by Edmund Burke. I found a small book, which actually had belonged to my mother, funnily enough. I'm not quite sure why, but she had it, but it was like a Penguin paperback that had come out in Britain just after the Second World War. It would have been in the late 40s. It was an election pamphlet written for the Conservatives, and there was a Labor equivalent, which was not terribly interesting. But this one was called The Case for Conservatism, and it was written by Quinton Hogg, later Lord Hailsham. Well, in fact, I think he was Lord Hailsham before, anyway, his descendant of a famous family. But anyway, Quinton Hogg wrote this book called The Case for Conservatism. And the first third of it was a really good assessment of what conservatism is or should be all about. And it distilled it very well. The rest of the book was about the politics of the day and the policy issues of the day, which are, I would say, somewhere between negligible and nil interest to anyone today. They're all sort of...
The historical record.
Historical record, yes, for historians of the time. Anyway, that led me into other works, like people like Lord Hugh Cecil and other writers about conservatism. So I was very, very interested in that. And of course, that's the sort of context, I guess. This is why I've always felt very comfortable with Menzies, because that was the philosophical, political context in which he came from. You see, most of the people who call themselves conservatives today are not, as I say, most of them wouldn't know the difference between Edmund Burke and Tony Burke, you know. They are literally...
Well, they've heard of Tony Burke.
Well, they've heard of Tony Burke, yeah, that's right, exactly. That's exactly right. And Edmund, who's he? Is that Ted Burke? No. So the problem is that you've now got on the... And this is where Menzies would be appalled. I mean, it's ridiculous talking about people that are long dead, what they would or would not have thought, but the sort of authoritarian populism that you see with a Trump or an Orban is something that Menzies would look at Trump or an Orban and says, man, I've seen that film before. It's called Mussolini and Hitler. But this is what so many people on the conservatives, so-called conservative side of politics are adopting, including in the Liberal Party. I mean, Tony Abbott extols Viktor Orban and says he is the type of conservative leader other nations would like to have. You've got Greg Sheridan writing in The Australian just the other day, and Greg's known since we were university students, and he's writing there defending Trump, saying how outrageous it is he's being charged for abstracting and retaining top secret documents, and defending Orban. So there is regrettably, what you're seeing now, and this is where it is so at odds with what Menzies stood for, so at odds. I mean, these people who call themselves conservatives today are the antithesis of what Menzies was about, because they're basically defending authoritarianism, and they are doing the reverse of what conservatives should do. Conservatives should defend established institutions, defend the rule of law, defend our traditions, and as Quinton Hogg said, whereas change occurs, integrate it carefully into the rich subsoil of British political culture so that it's organic growth. I mean, conservatives are not against change. I mean, reactionaries are.
Yeah.
But conservatives bring in the new, but carefully make sure that it works with the old, the best of the old. That's where conservatism is all about continuity, pragmatism, and that organic view of society. As Burke said, partnership between the living, the dead, and the generations yet to be born. But regrettably, on the sort of so-called right of politics at the moment, that type of viewpoint is barely represented.
Well, Menzies, of course, didn't want to be called a conservative.
No, exactly. That's exactly right.
He was quite clear about that. I mean, it's oft quoted.
I quoted him once in a speech in England, and I was roundly savaged by the Australian and various other people on the right of politics here for daring to say the truth, which was that Menzies was... The most obvious thing in the world was for Menzies to call his new party the Conservative Party, because he's absolutely an Anglophile. I mean, he regarded himself as British. This is now a footnote to what we're talking about, but one of the unjust criticisms of Menzies is to say that he was a British bootlicker and all that sort of stuff. I mean, Menzies was probably a little bit more dazzled by royalty than most people, even on his side of politics, were, but that was a minor issue. But in terms of his Britishness, both Menzies and his great rival Doc Evatt were at one in regarding themselves as British.
Well, you were British subjects back in the 50s.
Yeah,
that's what you were.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I mean, Australia was... Evatt, in the one debate in the House of Representatives in the 40s, quoted Churchill as saying to him, "The better an Australian a man is, the better a Britisher," And Menzies, of course, said in 48, the boundaries of Britain are not on the Kentish coast, but at Invercargill and Cape York. And when you go in 2023, you look at what people were saying in 1953, and you say, they were out of touch, they were British bootlickers or something. Well, they thought they were British. I mean, that's like saying that someone from Cornwall who talks about being British is somehow betraying their Cornishness. I mean, it's not. I mean, they honestly saw Australia as part of a British, not just a British empire, but a British polity. Anyway, well, I've digressed, and I apologise for that. But the bottom line is, yes, he wanted the Liberal Party to be very clearly seen as a progressive party and not as a conservative or reactionary party.
Yeah, he's very clear on that. And it's interesting too, it's not just Menzies, it was part of an Australian liberal, and I say that with a small L, liberal tradition, where they didn't want to be called conservatives. In the 19th century, Australian liberals did not like the term conservative. That was a term to be avoided. And they were very, very comfortable being called liberals. They didn't like the class system, the aristocracy. They didn't have truck with that in Australia. No. They wanted education for all people. And there's a reason why we gave women the vote here way before the Brits, and so many other progressive things happened in Australia because we were a very different society, despite the fact we did think of ourselves as British for quite some time. But as you know, Malcolm, context is everything when looking at the past. What we are saying today, in 50 years' time, people go, "Oh, Malcolm and Georgina, how old-fashioned." Well, yeah, sure.
Yeah, correct.
So very 2023.
Yeah, well, this is I did a little essay for The Economist a month or two ago, and I just looked at what the Crown meant in Australia in 1901, 1953, and today.
Yeah.
And it's completely different.
Of course.
And it was... In 1901, the Crown was the absolute reality, political, potent reality of British leadership and, in fact, domination. I mean, I use that term, that's not the right word, but in a sense, Australia was not an independent country in 1901 and didn't seek to be. It was a subordinate, self-governing part, largely autonomous part of the British Empire, but our own constitution reserves enormous powers for the Crown, which were intended to be exercised on the advice of the British government, not our government. So anyway, and that by the 50s we're independent, but we're still seeing ourselves as British, and then of course today it's a different thing altogether. Anyway, we're wandering around.
That's okay, that's all right.
This is what happens when you talk to old Prime Ministers.
Well, I feel very privileged to have that opportunity.
Oh.
So tell me, what do you think is the enduring importance of Menzies then to the Liberal Party today, when you were Prime Minister, when you were leader, when you joined in 73? I mean, there's... Well,
look, I think, it's part of the history. I think the Liberal Party could more or less cease to exist in the next 5 or 6 years if it continues on the trajectory it's on. And it may well fall to somebody else to do Menzies and start a new party. I mean, I think the Liberal Party's endurance is not something we can be overly confident about. certainly shouldn't be complacent about. Basically, the Liberal Party arose because the United Australia Party and some other, well, in those days they used to call anti-Labor or non-Labor parties, lost their mojo, lost their credibility. And I think that the Liberal Party it's today is at risk of that happening to it. It really is. So
won't be much of an 80th birthday celebration then next year if it...
Well, I think it faces real challenges, very, very profound challenges, which we can move on to. But look, in terms of Menzies, I think he's a great example. He was very resilient, he was determined, got dumped and then he came back, and that's always very good. He had a lot of luck, let's face it. Luck, as Napoleon said, give me generals that are lucky. You know, the Labor Party blew itself up with the split. I mean, I don't think anyone imagines Menzies would have been PM for as long as he was if Labor hadn't done that. And I mean, this is where luck, circumstance can be so significant in politics. I mean, we often say that governments lose elections, but that's actually not quite true. I mean, governments can lose elections, but oppositions can make themselves unelectable. I mean, look at the British Labor Party under Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
Once the British public focused on Corbyn and realised he was a chance to win, they ran a mile. I mean, Shorten lost in 19, truthfully. I mean, he, for a variety of reasons. And so Menzies was fortunate in that regard. His values were solid, but they were of their time. So there's plenty of things Menzies stood for which we'd be appalled by today. I mean, not least of which is his economic policy. I mean, his economics was far more involved, assumed far more state intervention, state ownership, state control, state regulation than the most left-wing person in the Australian Labor Party would today. So again, this is why, as you say, context is everything.
Yeah, yeah. How would you crystallise then today Australian liberalism in the form that you believe in?
Well, I don't think there's much left of it in the Liberal Party, unfortunately. I mean, I think the success of the Teals at the last election was by far the most significant thing to happen at that election. The reality is that there are now 9 of what had been our safest seats in the hands of independents who are all women, all smaller liberals, well, almost all. I was about to say sensible, it's fine for me to say that, but rational, mainstream, on economic issues. I mean, none of them they're certainly not advocating green economics, or at least not that I've noticed, but are progressive on social issues. And on any view, you'd say that Allegra Spender, Kate Chaney are smaller liberals, without any question. These are the electorates, the communities that had been the absolute foundation and bedrock of the Liberal Party. So if you don't recognise that as a problem, boy, you're not paying attention. So I think that's where liberalism has moved. And of course, as some of the moderates, the sort of more smaller liberal people in the Liberal Party would say, part of the problem is, of course, that the people they replaced were by and large smaller liberals themselves.
How did you find, as leader of the Liberal Party, navigating those differences though between, say, inner city areas, the outer suburbs versus the regional areas, Sydney versus Longreach? It's hard.
No, it is. It's not easy.
I mean, we are very different between the states.
As another Prime Minister called Malcolm used to say, life isn't meant to be easy. So, so being leader of the Liberal Party isn't easy, and being Prime Minister isn't easy, and it is difficult reconciling those things. But I think we're in a very, very, very difficult political environment nowadays. I think lying has been normalised. The media has become much more partisan, not as bad here as it is in the US. And that, coupled with social media, has meant that people are increasingly living in silos where, whether it is the editors at, say, the Murdoch outlets or the algorithms for social media, have the similar objective, which is to rile people up and make them angry. And so you've got people living in silos, being riled up, and they're unwilling to talk, they're less willing to talk with each other. I mean, if you go back to when the Sydney Morning Herald was founded, they had on there, which was I think about 1840, might have been a bit before then, they had on their front page some lines of Alexander Pope, in moderation placing all my glory while Tories call me Whig and Whigs a Tory. And that wasn't because the old Fairfaxes were especially broad-minded, but rather that they wanted to reach a wide audience, because hence more advertising dollars. Now you can monetize very narrow sections. Narrowcasting becomes viable. And I think, regrettably, a lot of people supporting the Liberal Party, who remain supporters of the Liberal Party, are living in a sort of a right-wing silo where a lot of illiberal and actually non-conservative opinions are being voiced, which are designed to rile people up. And this is all these culture war issues and so forth. And we're seeing the consequence of that at the ballot box. I mean, you look in your state in Victoria, Georgina, I mean, the Andrews government, whether you believe it deserved to get tipped out or not, on any view, it should have lost a bunch of seats.
Yeah.
There should have been a swing against them. Whether it was big enough to tip them out, I'm not a Victorian, so I don't have a view, but clearly all of the laws of politics, you would think, the natural law of politics would say they were going to get pushed back. Instead, they increased the majority.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary result. Yeah.
So for our 80th birthday, we're going to have to be thinking pretty carefully about what the future holds.
So is it impossible then these days to lead a national-based party that can clearly represent interests, inner city seats and rural seats, and navigate a coalition with a rural-based party? I mean, Menzies was able to do that, but it wasn't without difficulties. Howard was able to do that, but again, there were always difficulties.
Well, I mean, these guys are operating. Menzies, obviously, it was a very long time ago. Even Howard, who left office in 2007, social media had barely got started then. It's amazing how much the world has changed.
So would you say that difficulty leading a party is down to the rise of social media? I mean,
I'm not saying. I'm saying that's part of it. I think the fact that people are living in silos is a big problem. I mean, look at the US as a good example. A majority of Republican voters who support Trump, despite his obvious unfitness to be president. I mean, seriously. At any view, Trump is unfit to be president of the United States. Everything he did wasn't wrong, obviously. But this is a very flaky, erratic, strange, narcissistic character. I mean, just certainly not the type of person from a character point of view that should be president of the United States, to say the least. Not only does he attract the support of most Republicans, most of them believe he won the 2020 election in defiance of all the facts. So we're in a environment where fake news, lies, are being widely endorsed. I mean, Murdoch, he just wrote out a cheque for $787 million over this. So that even Rupert would have felt that sting of that payment. But the reality is Murdoch, a very experienced publisher, second generation media mogul, if you like, so someone who's absolutely got this industry in his veins, running it through his veins, he and the rest of the people at Fox pumped out those lies knowing they were lies. So what does that tell you about what's gone wrong? I could never have conceived that a major publisher would have published material that was so consequentially and dangerously untrue, knowing it was untrue. So we're in a dangerous world, and this is the world politics operates in. I mean, politics operates in an ecosystem which is made up of the media. Now, that doesn't mean the opinion pages of a few newspapers. That's the whole thing. That's social media, mainstream media, the works. And we're operating in that environment which has increasingly become untethered from truth. It's increasingly become focused on what I call entertainment. And it's making political parties generally, but the Liberal Party in particular, very hard to manage. I mean, after the 2019 election, when you had all of those seats going to the Teals, the characters like Peter Credlin, the rest of the people in that right-wing media ecosystem, were saying the party had lost because it'd been too much like Labor, too left. Well, wow. So do you think they lost Wentworth because the party was seen as being too left? I don't think so. Living there, I'm familiar.
I was going to say you're a lifetime resident of Wentworth, so I think
I can be relied on as an authority on that seat, at least.
I would defer to your authority on that, having been a very infrequent tourist to Wentworth and only that. Malcolm, I wondered if we could shift track a bit and talk about how you came into politics, because you, of course, were at the bar in journalism and doing some very high-profile things and, of course, getting involved in the Republican movement as well. But all those, you had a really rich career in terms of experience and you came to politics by choice, very much giving up a different trajectory.
Well, I was 50 when I got into Parliament. We're quite old, I suppose, or older.
Well, experienced, I think, let's say, with deep experience.
Deep experience, that's true.
But it's often said of politics, and of course John Howard has often said this quite publicly, that politicians can often be careerists and Parliament is too dominated by careerists who are coming out of ministers' offices straight into a pre-selection bang or out of the union movement straight into pre-selection and bang into the Parliament and then there for sort of 20-odd years. What were your reflections coming to politics from such a different background?
Well, look, I'd always been close to politics and public affairs and public issues, so I was an active citizen. I think it's good to have a mix of people that have been in politics that are professional politicians, if you like, or political professionals, perhaps a better way of putting it. But I think it's very good to have people from a range of backgrounds. I mean, I always thought that was one of the strengths of the Liberal Party room over the Labor Party room.
Yeah.
There are very few people in their party room that have not come through that university, trade union, official or political office into Parliament. And so I think it was good that we had more of a range of different life's experiences. But I think that's diminishing, to be honest. I think if you did the tally now, you'd find we were looking closer to the Labor Party. I remember when I was a political journalist in the state parliament here in Sydney in the mid-70s, Labor's members most of them were, a very large percentage of them were trade unionists, naturally. I mean, the Labor Party is the political wing of the trade union movement, so there's no surprise there. But they were much more likely to be genuine, horny-handed sons of toil, like Jack Ferguson, Neville Rand's deputy, who was, I think, was a brickie. And he is a guy who'd come up from the shop floor, as it were. And there were plenty of people like that. Nowadays, there are very few people in the Labor Party in Canberra, I think, that have actually worked in the trades or occupations that they represented as union officials. Which is why I used to tease them and say, for most of them, manual labour is a Mexican bandit. They're unfamiliar with these things. So
Whereas I was listening to a podcast you'd done where you were talking about how you worked at the fruit markets, hauling watermelons and bananas. And, I mean, you were in manual labour.
No. Well, this is how I first met Bob Carr, of course.
Yes, I heard. You were underpaid.
That's right. I wanted him to get some money back for me. And we ended up talking about Eastern European politics instead. We became very good friends. So I came in at 50. I think a lot of people...
Do you think that made you a different politician from someone, say like my father, he came in at 32.
Well, I mean, if
he had a bit of a career in diplomacy.
That's right, exactly.
Banking.
That's right. But I mean, I ran for Wentworth in 1981 and nearly won it. Very nearly won it, much to Lucy's horror. And how old was I then? 81. I was 26, so I turned 26 in 1980. So, God knows what I would have been like if I'd gotten to Parliament at 26, but just as well I didn't. But I think it's definitely a benefit. Having said that, I'd make this observation. I think a lot of people who are in politics think business is easy, and a lot of people in business think politics is easy, and the reality is neither of them are easy. So as long as you approach it with a degree of realism or humility even, that's never properly been my strong point, but just being realistic about it, and it is a different line of work. I think some people in business struggle in politics because particularly if they've been CEOs, because they're used to, telling people what to do and being the unquestioned boss, and even as Prime Minister you can't do that.
No.
Like you're constantly dealing with herding cats, whatever, pick your metaphor, it's complicated.
Well, and of course, when you were Prime Minister, you navigated some extremely difficult policy issues that were divisions within your own party on. I mean, same-sex marriage is the perfect example.
One, yeah.
I mean, people said, well, you should have just pushed it through. You might have got it through the parliament,
but
you had a government and a party to keep together.
I know, but I mean, it's amazing how many people have no understanding, but even basic understanding of how the parliament and politics works.
I mean, John Howard used to say, as Prime Minister, you're just first among equals.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. You are, and people will generally defer to the Prime Minister, but when you're dealing with these very hot button issues, you've got to recognise some political realities. I mean, as it happens, I think the same-sex marriage thing worked out brilliantly. I honestly do. I think the vote, we had a voluntary vote, but 80% of people participated, which is amazingly high. It's only 93 or so in a parliamentary election where you get fined if you don't vote. So that was pretty good, very good, and it was a very big yes vote. So we were able to say, look, the people have voted. And so that meant that someone like Christopher Pyne, who was very much in support of same-sex marriage, legalising it, but had some very conservative constituents, he was able to say, look, you had a vote, I had a vote, we may have voted differently, but we had the same vote, and look, there's a clear majority in Australia, a clear majority in this electorate, we're a democracy, that's how it rolls. And so it was a good way of resolving it. But one of the criticisms at the time was people said, oh, you should have just had a free conscience vote, free vote. Well, it's easy to say, I'm not sure the party room absolutely was against that. But the reality is it wouldn't have got through the Senate, even if you might have got it through the House, because there are quite a few Labor people weren't going to vote for it,
Yeah.
I mean, particularly in the Senate, there was, I can't remember how many, like maybe half a dozen Labor people were not going to vote for it. So I don't think I'm quite satisfied in saying there was no way we could have got that legislated in the Parliament at that time without the popular vote. So it did work out well. And no thanks to the Labor Party, who did everything they could to prevent us holding the vote.
Is that the thing of which you're most proud from your Prime Ministership?
Oh, no, I don't. I mean, I've written a sort of a short pamphlet, 750 pages of memoir, but so there's lots of things in there. But no, I'm certainly proud, pleased, whatever. All of these things are team efforts. That was a very complicated political exercise, pulling that off. All these things look easy when they're done.
Yes, indeed.
But it was definitely an important achievement. But there are a lot of other things we did on the international scale, a lot of domestic policy reforms, big infrastructure projects. I got more done in the just under 3 years I was PM than I thought I'd be able to do, given the circumstances. So I wasn't.
Well, you had all the Section 44 by-elections to deal with, which is when we came to...
Yes. It wasn't when we first met.
No, it wasn't when we first met. No, I think that was in 2004 when you first came to Parliament.
That's right,
yeah. And what about regrets? Do you have any regrets from your time as Prime Minister?
Well, I regret that we couldn't get energy policy settled. But, Morrison couldn't do it either. That issue is look, a lot got done anyway, but the truth is that when Abbott decided to make, and it wasn't just Abbott, it was other people on the right, it was the right-wing press and so forth, when they decided to take energy policy or climate policy and turn it into a culture war issue, it was a catastrophe for us, catastrophe for our party, and it did a lot of damage to Australia. But once that sort of genie was let out of the bottle, you've got to remember, Howard went to the 07 election promising an emissions trading scheme.
I remember. Is it because of the nature of our economy, do you think, that we have been traditionally so reliant on fossil fuels for our own energy generation, but also for export, that it makes it so much harder for Australia than, say, the UK? I mean, you go to the UK, climate, energy policy are not a big issue there.
I think that's part of it, Georgina. I think clearly there isn't a big fossil fuel sort of lobby.
So the stakes aren't as high for them.
But I think the kind of culture war politics that has been such a feature of the right in the US, to the point where it's basically taken over the Republican Party, has always had more traction here than it has in the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking to Theresa May about this recently on a podcast. I mean, we concluded that the British and the Australians were more sensible than the Americans, but I mean, that's easy for Britain and Australia. So I'm not sure that's the right explanation, but it is I'm sure the big fossil fuel industry is part of it. But it's interesting that we ended up with an issue that is essentially driven by physics. So in saying you don't believe in global warming, as I always say, it's like saying you don't believe in gravity. You know, it's a thing. You've just got to get used to it. It doesn't matter. You may not believe in gravity, but if you open the window and jump out, you'll find out gravity believes in you.
Yes,
believes that you're going to fall. And it's just a nightmare. As I said, the turning of it into a culture war issue has been I think one of the single biggest failures in politics in Australia. Having said that, we've still got very high penetration of renewables. I mean, we were lucky to keep the renewable energy target, despite Tony wanted to abolish it, but essentially his cabinet pushed back on him on that. We kept that going. Rooftop solar was always very popular in Australia. Australians really like that. And so we've got the highest penetration of rooftop solar in the world. And I think now the sort of climate denialist thing is really just going on inside the Liberal Party and the National Party. I mean, in the mainstream of Australian society, people are recognising this is something we've got to do, we've got to get on with it, but we've got to do it in a sensible way. As I used to say when I was in politics, we need engineering and economics, not ideology and idiocy.
Sounds about right.
And that's true, whether you're on the sort of green end or the brown end, if that's the right word. If you're going to shut down a coal-fired power station, you've got to do so in circumstances where you know you've got enough firmed renewables to take its place. That's all. It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
And I think we've now, after Hazelwood in particular, we're totally alert to that. And so that's what AEMO does. They're very fastidious about that.
Something that Robert Menzies, I think, set a very good example for future political leaders in Australia was his ability beyond the cut and thrust of everyday politics. And, you know, there were big battles back in his day, of course, over communism and
and of course that was a help to me. I said to him, said that he was lucky, lucky in the sense that the Labor Party blew itself up over communism, but also you had the socialist menace was real.
Yes. Absolutely. Within and without.
Yeah, within and without. Yeah. So,
But he was able to still maintain very decent relations with his opponents, his political opponents. I mean, famously with John Curtin, there's lovely letters he exchanged when he resigned as Prime Minister in 1941 with John Curtin, how he really valued the friendship, and likewise John Curtin valued the friendship with Menzies. With Ben Chifley, he was a pallbearer at Chifley's funeral.
Yep.
Doc Evatt came to Heather Henderson's wedding. I mean, you know, these are relationships that you would have thought were professional, but mainly full of animosity in the normal sort of cut and thrust of things. But he was able to keep that civility in politics. And it's something actually, the Ronald Reagan Library in California, they've actually just created a centre for civility in politics. And it's being headed by the now former editor of the Washington Post. And I wondered if you could reflect on how Australia deals with civility in politics these days, and whether maybe we could have such a centre in Australia. Would that be of value?
Well, I'll throw out a couple of thoughts. I think the hyper-partisanship of the media that I've talked to is part of it. Yes. I think that's part of the problem. I think the era that you're talking about, you mentioned Evatt and Menzies. I mean, both of them were barristers. As you know, as a lawyer, the people who come up through the legal profession, particularly in the bar, are used to having ferocious disputation with their opponent in the court case, and then having dinner with them or being, I mean, you might be very good friends socially with someone who is going to be ripping your arguments to shreds and desiccating your witnesses and so forth. So I think there's a bit of that. I think also another thing, and these are just straws, right? So leave it to a great analyst like you to put it all together. But I think architecture's a part of it too. I actually think the new Parliament's really badly designed building. I mean, we're stuck with it, I regret to say, probably for 1,000 years. But I mean, it would be indestructible. I don't think even a direct nuclear hit could take it out. It is, after all,
I love how it's still new Parliament, though.
Yeah.
It was opened in 1988.
But if you think of the old Parliament,
yes.
It was full of serendipitous encounters. Now, I never served in it, but we had the Constitutional Convention there in 98, so I had I was there for a couple of weeks. You had a feeling for its scale, the fact that you're always bumping into people. It lent itself to a degree of intimacy.
Yeah.
The new Parliament on top of the hill is so vast. Everyone is isolated. When I was Howard's assistant minister, parliamentary secretary in 2006, I could walk from my office, which was right down the end of one of the House of Reps wings, to his office in a sitting week, and I might pass one or two or most three people.
Wow.
You've got thousands of people in that building, but they're all isolated. There isn't a bar. The only sort of place for conviviality, if you can call it that, is the Aussies Cafe, which is pretty desperate. I mean, the dining room is barely used. And so there isn't the regular serendipitous encounters. So I did not have many, if any, I mean, I had a few, but not many friends on the other side of the chamber.
Yeah.
And that was a pity, because I quite liked some of the people on the other, would have liked to have known them better.
So you're more likely to hang out at the Qantas Club or the Chairman's Lounge, I guess.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's true.
Than you would in Parliament House.
I agree. I totally agree with you. I think that was a mistake in the design. I mean, Parliament should be about interactions, compromise. I mean, I used to get accused regularly of horse trading in the Senate, and I used to say, well, the Senate should have a sign over it which says horse trading central. I mean, that's what Parliament is designed for, horse trading. That's right. If we wanted to elect a dictator, we'd have an election every 3 years and just elect one person as dictator. We would elect a Parliament. So you've got to talk to everyone. And whether they're your own people, sensible or not, the Labor Party, the Greens, crazy sometimes. I mean, some of the independents I dealt with in the Senate in my time, wow. I mean, there was a guy from Perth who I think initially got elected on a One Nation ticket, I can't remember his name now, went bankrupt, got to leave, but I would sit with him, he talked to me for half an hour, and if he said to me, now your life depends on writing a summary of what he just said to you, I would have said...
You'd be facing the firing squad?
Facing the firing squad, there's nothing I could do. So...
Well, Malcolm, thank you for that lovely conversation. It's wonderful to hear your reflections.
It's a bit discursive.
No, it's what we like.
Good, all right.
Thank you so much for joining us on Afternoon Live.
Thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.